it is a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this rather rare event. And people like us aren't a big community. Neither we don't represent the bigger picture of the society, but we are a small group, but very potent, who can make difference in the community. Our small voices, our small attempt to make change, or our small attempt to spread our free thinking, the principles of rationality and humanism, yes, it is making ripples, but probably not to the extent we would like to have. The format of this program, as detailed in our many previous advertisement and leaflets, there's a youth section of this program. We do have 3 group of young people here who are going to speak to you. These youth are probably a small representation of our children. There are more children out there who probably didn't get those opportunities, or those children who couldn't come here because of whatever reasons, whether their family, whether their belief, whether their alliance. They're also important to think about because, obviously, whether the schools they've been or whether the community they've been, probably they didn't get the opportunity as these kids. So it is also a time to think about those kids. To start this program, I would like to make a brief introduction about these young people. I have Jovial here. Jovial is an year 8 student, very young, probably in comparison, you wouldn't see an year 8 student getting an opportunity or a stage like this. He's a passionate follower of mathematics. That's his main subject. He's been engaging with the Royal Mathematical Society for some time, and it is a great pleasure to have you here to give your thoughts and ideas to this small group of audience. Our next young man is Manas. He's currently studying year 13. And what is astonishing about him is he has already published a book in his name, Broken Manacles. Obviously, I'm not going into the details of the book itself because that is his subject, so he's going to brief about that. But the unique community and being managed to get to this level is what we should be proud of and we should be applauding. And moving on to our next group of youth, we have here Lexi Amphoma, Elizabeth Matthew, and Nicola Matthew from Springwood School at King's Lynn. They've been doing speaking as part of their school team and individually for, I would say, last 1.5 years. Recently, they've been part of the Rotary International sponsored national school competition. They've been the semi-finalist as a team, and Nicola being the best speaker winner. Again, these kids are not here because of their parents or because of their upbringing, purely because of the community and the society and the teachers who supported them throughout their journey, who made them confident and and being competitive. It is also a pleasure to welcome you 3 here from such a long distance. Obviously, Joel as well, coming from over 200 miles travel. Manas, I'm not discriminating you in any way or form, but obviously your efforts also appreciable. So the first person I'm going to invite to the stage is Jovial for your presentation. Thank you. So the first person I'm going to invite to the stage is Jovial for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So, as Mr. Matthews has said, my name is Joel, and I'm doing a presentation on mathematics in the world around us. And although it may be quite cliche, it is quite an important topic, and I believe that it hasn't been taught well enough. So, what does the title mean, and is math all that it's cracked out to be? So, mathematics, by definition, is the abstract science of number, quantity, and space. It has helped us uncover the realms of space, the depths of the sea, and the marvel of the land. And yet all this can be classed as understanding. Let me explain. So, the year was 1665, and at the time, Isaac Newton had been asked by his fellow friend and fellow professor, John Locke, about whether he would be able to prove why all the planets in the solar system move in an elliptical orbit, meaning that they move in an oval path. Although it may seem like a lackluster challenge, and trust me, it was, we should note that for the first month and a half of tackling this challenge, Isaac Newton hadn't gone anywhere. Why? Because the mathematics at the time wasn't good at all, and Isaac Newton on his own had to form his own formula. Some of you may know it as calculus. So calculus is still used today in scientific and engineering for many different purposes. And so to say, we've actually been blessed with maths, but that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is to highlight that maths back then wasn't good for Isaac Newton to explain his thesis. And for us at the moment, it still isn't good enough. But like us, like man, it should be able to evolve and eventually solve more and more complex queries. So moving on. So let's start with a puzzle, officially start. So the setting is 1939. You are a mathematician in World War II and have been hired to figure out where to put reinforcement on various fighter planes that have just came back from war. Specifically, the P-40 Warhawk. This is to ensure that your nation's planes are stronger than that of your enemies. So many planes went into the war zone, and during the period of 6 years, over 475,000 aeroplanes were used. So some never came back, but fortunately enough, some came back, but at the cost of large bullet holes in various parts of the plane. You know that logically you can't put too much reinforcement on the plane, or else it will not fly well, due to the excess amount of weight. But you also decide that you want to reinforce certain areas, such as the engine, the fuselage, the fuel system, and yeah. So now you work out the density of bullets per square foot. All of those certain areas that you want to cover are listed in here. So in the engine, there's 0.2 bullet holes per square foot, 1.8 in the fuselage, 1.6 in the fuel system, and 1.9 in the wing. So just looking at this, we can tell that the wing has the highest density of bullets. So surely you should just reinforce that. But should you split it 50-50 and reinforce the fuselage and the fuel system? Or perhaps you have another idea. I'm going to ask you all, as the audience, to come up with an idea. Yeah. Does anyone have any ideas at all? You there? Okay, that's a good idea. Well, this task was also assigned to by US officers to the mathematician Abraham Wald. But his answer surprised the officers. He said that the engine should be covered. Why? Well, rather than looking at the plane that he was presented with, he had analysed the missing planes and why they had gone missing. And with the engine being the powerhouse of the plane, one hit could have meant that it would literally drop from the sky. Although you can argue that planes are able to glide for 10 to 15 minutes, I hardly think that with an enemy plane shooting constantly at you, your plane would be flying for more than a minute. So now moving on. By using the logic Mr. Wald had, he had analysed the missing planes and why they had crashed, rather than the planes that survived. Although this may never happen to you, the reality is we use maths everywhere. But for anyone here, have you ever thought, when you were studying maths at like high school or college or sixth form, when will you ever use this? For instance, quadratic formulas, synthetic division, and such. When will this ever come up? Well, the answer, in many cases, is never. But there are exceptions, of course, for those going into maths, science, engineering, just to name a few. But what you learn in secondary education is not what maths is. Maths can be more profound. For instance, look at this table. Firstly, we have profound and shallow variants of mathematics. And on the bottom row, we have the simple and complicated variants of maths. Add two numbers together, or memorizing some basic formula, is simple and shallow. There's no real depth here. Doing some indefinite integrals is both shallow and complicated, as although it is fairly complex, it's just doing a repeated formula. The profound and complicated variants of maths are things that many high school students or some college students wouldn't have been taught. For instance, 2 of the Millennial Maths goals, which were set in 2000, such as the Riemann hypothesis or the Poincare conjecture, involves abstract concepts and is what pure maths is generally about. It's heavily proof-based, and this is what it is heavily proof-based. So finally moving on to our final segment, which is the profound and simple sector. This is what this presentation is about. It's to be able to use basic logic to determine an answer or conclusion to a problem. You don't need any algebra knowledge whatsoever, but what you do need is quintessential skills such as reasoning, interpreting, and many more. So, for instance, when we think of a question or just try and solve it, we often need to ask ourselves, what are we assuming, and are those assumptions that we have made valid? Moving on. Well, I bet you weren't expecting this. So, brain cancer, otherwise known as malignant brain tumour, is medically known as the cancerous growth in the brain. There are numerous symptoms of it and numerous treatments. However, some don't help at all. The average life expectancy after diagnosis is generally 5 years. The rate of brain cancer has increased steadily by 4% over the last decade. So, moving quite swiftly on, this is a map of North America, and it shows which states have the highest population, with green being low and bright red being incredibly high. Anyway, in regards to the topic at hand, we can tell that California here has the highest records of brain cancer. However, if we look at the proportion of those with brain cancer in comparison to the state's population, we can tell that South Dakota, Nebraska, Alaska, Delaware, and Maine have the highest rates that are above average in the US. Whereas, on the contrary, the states at the bottom of this list have below average rates of brain cancer. These are Wyoming, Vermont, North Dakota, and Hawaii. This is information from the National Cancer Trust. So anyway, from a linear perspective, it may seem as if we should just stay away from these states. But realistically, we should be asking ourselves, why is it like this? And is there a medical epidemic in these states? Or is there something else at play? Let's find out, shall we? Keep in mind what we've been taught on this slide, and just remember it for the next. So let's just play a game. So let's see who can flip the coin and get heads the most. A simple game. Person 1 on my right will be flipping the coin 10 times, whereas person 2 on my left is going to be flipping a coin 100 times. It wouldn't be fair to count the sheer amount of heads, as person 2 will always win, as it will have a higher amount. So rather, we're going to measure it in percentages. So when person 1 gets, let's say, 5 heads, that means his percentage is 50%. Whereas when person 2 flips 48 heads, his percentage is 48. So we aren't going to play this game once, as this may be based around pure luck. So rather, we're going to play the game 10 times, as shown by the example. We'll take the top percentage from both trials, and whoever has the highest wins. So the first 10 trials that person 1 may get would be 4 on the first, 5 on the second, 4 on the third, and as such. So his highest person 2, on the other hand, would get 58 or 55, 48, 46, 57, etc. So person 1 here has the highest percentage, as he has got an 8 or a 9 in his 10 trials, meaning that in his trials here, his highest score is 80%. But for person 2, there are numbers that are much closer to 50, which is what we would generally expect. The highest percentage is 59. And so they lose. According to Professor Lawrence Harding from the University of Cambridge, you'll need to play the game 1 billion times before person 2 would get a head, or get heads 80 out of the 100 times that he flips. If we were to record the amount of flips versus the percentage of heads, you would see something quite interesting. So after 1 flip, perhaps, you can say that you've got head once. So that means you've got heads 100% of the time. But a second, you may get tails, meaning that your percentage has dropped to 50%. And then on the third, you may get tails again, meaning that your percentage has dropped to an even lower 33.3%. As out of those 3 flips, you only got heads once. But if you were to connect these points and keep on flipping, then your graph would start to look like this. The curvature of the graph seems to get closer and closer to 50%, and mathematically, this is what we establish as the chance of getting a head or a tail, 50%. So this is known as the law of large numbers, as a large number of trials tends to go to the expected value, which here is our chance of 50-50. So whereas a small value is affected by the luck of a draw, as shown by our first, second and third flips, we can tell that as it keeps on flipping, the value keeps on getting closer and closer, as shown by the curvature. So now, return to the segment on brain cancer. Do you notice that every state that I've mentioned is low in population? Well, just like person 1, who had flipped a coin 10 times, might get 3 heads or 9 heads out of 10 if he experimented enough. If we look at enough states with low population, they'll be subject to more extreme outcomes, whether it be high or low. It's the same thing if you look at the shots made by NBA rookies and just players in the NBA overall. They show that the highest percentage of shots were made by a rookie who has barely ever played, but analysing it more in depth, we can tell that he's only made a few shots and got lucky with those ones. Hence why many rookies aren't counted until they play a certain amount of games. So what we can learn from all this so far is that it's really easy to learn something that is true, so let's say a higher percentage of people have brain cancer in South Dakota than any other state. But without a reason for why, we can often come up with our very own wrong conclusions. Like, there must be an epidemic in that state. So now when you get presented with data, I now hope that you can learn to always have an open mind about it. and about what could have caused that, and perhaps there may be evidence behind the scenes that could very much easily disprove any assumption you've made. Now, looking at an issue from across the world, forest fires. They are abundant in areas near the equator and have been highlighted to the public through numerous news articles and just the news overall. However, what area do you commonly associate with forest fires? Well, does anyone want to put their hands up? You, sir. Pardon? Yeah, the Amazon one. But what I've got down here is Australia. It's actually abundant with forest fires due to the mostly hot, dry, and humid climate. Each year, fires impact extensive areas. Over the past 3 years, over 432,000 acres of land has been burnt to crisp during these wildfires. However, fortunately enough, over the last 18 months, the Australian government has invested 560 million Australian dollars into software which can predict where forest fires will go to and what areas they will lead on to. But how does it work? Well, keep in mind what you've been told, and now moving swiftly on, look at this. It's a simple 8x8 graph, but in the middle of it is a red square. The red square could signify a square acre of forest that has been engulfed in flames. The red square is our starting point for our forest fire. There is number 1 surrounding all 4 sides. I'll get onto that. I'll get onto why later. But now let's move on to stage 2. So here we see that the red square is spread to various other parts of the sheet. But rather than being red again, we're presented with a dark red colour that shows a spread in the shape of a cross. The number 1 is still surrounding the perimeter of the shape. But now, moving on to stage 3, once again, the shape is surrounded by number 1s. But rather in the corners, it's orange. So now, you may be thinking why I've bothered to even explain this to you. As, after all, why am I even bothering showing you this? Additionally, why is the spread of red spreading like this? And also, why into those shades? Well, let's reimagine this. Has anyone here ever spilled ink or any form of liquid onto paper? If you have, well, you would know that it would look something like this. Similar to our chart before, there is a large amount of ink in the centre. And I mean, that is to be expected. But that is also where the red zone is, or red square is. So, do you see the similarities building up? Also, again, we see that some ink has spread out into the same cross formation. And as we saw prior on the previous slide, that has gone into the dark red areas. Let's not also forget the small amount of ink that's spread to the corners, which we had down as the orange sectors. So for those who clocked on, you should understand why those numbers were there in the first place. But nevertheless, let's convert this into an actual forest. So now, rather than having colours, this time we have an aerial image of a forest fire. But this time, the abundance of the fire in that square mile is signified by the transparency of the image. Let's also add the numbers we saw before. So, numbers here represent the sides of which the fire is most likely to spread through. So, moving on to stage 2, again, the numbers still remain, but this time the fire has spread, again, into a cross formation. But if you can see, in the corners, there are 2 sets of 1 that are adjacent to each other. We could almost put them into a 2, because 1 plus 1 is 2. So that means there's a higher chance of fire spreading into that corner than there is to the sides, with just 1, 1. And, like we predicted, it spread through the corners, and now it's become a similar shape to what we began with, a square. But hopefully you can understand that there's other scenarios in which there are other factors that could come into play. For instance, the wind has a very big very big impact in this, as perhaps the wind speed, if it was per se 30 miles per hour, could impact the way the fire moves. So rather than moving equally to the left and right, it may just move to the right. So now coming to an end, I hope that all of you have seen like various similarities between perhaps a simple coin game and how we can have like more understanding about brain cancer, and also about forest fires and about the software behind it, as well as just the simple mathematics behind a warplane. So, yeah, thank you all for your attention, and yes.